So today I have with me Brent, Neil, and Lindsay, who will be talking about innovative teaching in the high school classroom. So have you ever heard the complaint that, oh, these students are complaining that history is boring, or that once you get to university, the history they've learned in high school has to be retaught. That's not happening in these classrooms, and you won't hear those complaints here. So they will be sharing the ways they have been engaging with students and making this history unforgettable in their classrooms. First, I'd like to invite Brent up for his presentation about simulating history. He has been, and correct me if I make a mistake,
Sure.
At Waterloo Collegiate for the past 25 years.
Yeah.
Roughly, and the head of the department since 2001. So him, as well as our other two presenters today, have many years in the field, and they speak from experience. So I welcome Brent.
Okay, thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome.
Jessica found a very, very polite way to call me old, I think. And I run into two former students actually in the hallways here, one of whom is presenting as we speak, and another one who, I thought she was still at McGill, and she said, oh no, I graduated 2 years ago. Something funny happens in the history teacher's brain, when they leave, it's kind of, they all go into this vortex of graduates, and then, and Katie, her name is, also found a nice way to call me old, so that was good. What I intend to do is talk about a few of the simulations that I use in my classroom, and I really should begin this presentation with, and you should never do this, I know, but with a few confessions. The one confession is nothing I'm going to present to you is particularly high-tech. I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I'm comfortable with that at this stage of my career. Secondly, the other thing I would say is nothing is really new here. What I've done is taken some ideas, and we'll perhaps talk about this in the panel discussion afterwards, and adapted them and tried to use them in my senior classes, mainly my grade 12 law and politics classes, and also grade 10 history. The other thing I should confess at the beginning, and I said this to my former charge, is that my big confession really is that I'm a political scientist. So thank you for being so welcoming to a heretic within your cathedral. So I know there's sometimes a conflict between those two areas. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit anyway is how we can try to get our students, engage our students in a way where they actually try to fill the shoes, not only of historical figures, but also of political figures. It's a little bit easier, frankly, with my grade 12 law and politics classes. And then I'm going to talk about a new experiment I'm going to try. And as I'm sure Lindsay and Neil will confirm, a lot of the times in teaching high school history, you have to be prepared to fail magnificently. So whether I actually have the courage to use this one and instead just throw it up to my grade 12 law class will be determined. As I said, really, the purpose of some of these simulations is really just to get the kids not only out of their seats, but out of their comfort zones, in an attempt to get them to take on the role of politician, to take on the role of first minister, as you'll see. And that, I think, is what engages them. That no longer, if you try to teach, for instance, the many intricacies, the 6 basic features of the amending formula of Canada's Constitution, you'll begin to see, eyes roll, and it won't be a pleasant experience. So if you can do it in a simulation, it's a much more rewarding experience. And then the debriefing session afterwards is, from my point of view anyway, really the valuable part. So just to give you some examples of what I do. In my politics class in grade 12, one of the very last things that we do is a parliamentary simulation where the students elect themselves members of the House of Commons. And this is sort of a 5 or 6 week process. So time is, as I'll point out later, is always a big issue. And so when you do this, they end up forming political parties. They have to elect leaders. They have to create political platforms, which they can then share on Google Classroom and so forth. The government has to write a speech from the throne, which, this may be my own political bias, but the ones I've had lately have been better than the real ones. And not just in the ideas, frankly, the writing is better. And then that sets the stage for sort of a one-day parliamentary simulation that we do near the very end of the year, the end of the course, where we begin with the reading of the speech from the throne. We have the debate on the address and reply to the speech from the throne, followed by a question period. The government, if it survives up to that point, tries to pass a bill. Thing goes on for the entire day, sometimes well after school. And then success or failure in this is largely based on whether the government survives the day. I think in the 20 years I've been doing it, I've had one majority government and 19 minority governments, which is useful. I did my MA thesis on minority governments in Canada, so I'm able to provide them some useful advice. I also do a First Ministers Conference on Senate reform, which I've been doing probably for about 8 or 10 years. And again, as I said a few minutes ago, part of the issue is dealing with, especially in a law class, the drier aspects of Canadian constitutional law. Now, before the Senate became a big issue, as it has recently, I chose Senate reform because it's really a classic example of how to basically take provinces and pit them against each other. And of course now, with the most recent Supreme Court decision thwarting the plans of the current government to do a lot of things unilaterally, that certainly added interest to it. And the kids come up with some really interesting proposals, actually. I think only once did they ever agree to abolish the thing, which is of course ridiculous given that Quebec, for instance, would never agree to this. But that's part of what you can glean out of these things. I do a UN simulation in both my international law class and also my politics class. And the fun part there is, of course, we basically it's a simulation of the Security Council dealing with a international crisis. And very similar to the parliamentary simulation, they have to create position papers, they can share them, and then we have a day of basically trying to get a resolution past the Security Council. The fun part for me is creating the nightmare scenario, which I don't want to claim any gifts of prophecy here, but more than once I've actually predicted something that's going to happen about 2 years later. You may recall Israel and Lebanon a few years ago. That was the scenario, and then the kids who went through this afterwards said, "How did you know?" And I was like, "Well, it's not a bad guess, really, if you know the history." And so they have to respond to it, and then occasionally I'll open it up to maybe even throwing in a curve if things are just a little too friendly. The occasional political assassination occurs, and it's great fun as we go through. What that's useful for is, for those of you who have ever taught, the finer points of the United Nations, similar to the Canadian Constitution, kind of stultifying. So it allows them to take on those roles, and it also allows them to see, just as the parliamentary simulation does, has them role play perspectives that they may not necessarily share or like. I had a lot of fun last year with an Iranian-Canadian student who got assigned Israel, and a former Israeli student who got Iran. And at first they were like, "Oh, we can't do this." And I thought, well, it'll be a really interesting intellectual exercise, then won't it? So I heard them and then ignored them, and they both learned a lot, actually. The new one I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is a First Ministers Conference simulation based on the 1981 patriation round, the famous November 1981 conference, which I think has a lot of interest, increasingly because of the anniversary just recently. But also, there's really a lot you can glean out of this for students to try to look at and put those historical events in their context. Finally, I should notice that, or make note to you anyway, that we take the Federal Provincial Conference idea in Waterloo sort of to a grand scale in an event that's sponsored with the University of Waterloo, where we bring about 400 students from across Waterloo County together for 2 days at the University of Waterloo, where they again role play these roles of the federal government, the provinces, the territories, First Nations, as well as the press. There's actually 2 student presses which cover it. And then of course, with what you can do online now has made it really a lot of interest. So that's sort of a quick overview of sort of what I do. As I said, this allows you to deal with some sometimes rather dry material in hopefully an engaging way. There is a natural competitiveness that you can really tap into here, especially the parliamentary simulation, where they are clinging to power sometimes. This becomes a very student-centered activity, which is always good. I think, instead of me. I sort of become the constitutional advisor, or I become the human advisor, just to guide them a little bit. But it's very much the ownership for these events is really taken by them. Last thing I would say too is we do have a mandate in our curriculum to bring in current affairs. This is a really nice way to do it as we go through these things. In order for these things to work, you really have to have the right group of students sitting in front of you. They very much have to be extraordinarily well prepared. There's a research phase in this process that they very much have to take seriously. It is good though, even in a social sciences class where you can get them actually looking at some really good primary documents, so you can really focus on those primary document skills, so that's useful across the curriculum. And as I said, that for these things to work, it has to be very clear and very clearly defined for the students exactly what they're setting out to do. The scenario, for instance, in the UN simulation, you have to give a lot of thought to, because you're hoping certain things are going to happen. Same with the parliamentary simulation, that you do have to get into the finer points of parliamentary procedure. Again, not the most exciting topic, but once they understand, they can start to use points of order, for instance, as weapons in parliamentary debate. That's really a good learning moment. There's lots of different philosophies about how you group students together. If you want success in any of these things, I think the teacher really has to play a really big role in choosing the groups. And you can have some fun with it too, right? Because the students are going to be working together. And as silly as this sounds, the setting really matters. I'm very fortunate to work in a school that has an auditorium, so we can make liberal use of that auditorium for these type of events. You need a big space, so try to do it just within your classroom sometimes is very difficult. So for instance, like this is a picture taken at the Federal Provincial Conference where we use the amphitheater there, and get your department head to invest in some flags. I know that sounds silly, and they're horrendously expensive, I should tell you. But it's also it sets the tone for the event, and if the tone is properly set, as we know in our classrooms on a daily basis, then you're going to get a lot more success from your students. Now there are some cautions I would point out. One of them is that sometimes you can get into the weird world of counterfactual history, where they come up with, if they don't play the role properly, then this creates some issues. Hopefully though, if they've taken the research stage of this whole process seriously, then that won't happen. At the same time, if you do get an unexpected result, and then when you teach, what would actually happen, or what you predict would happen, that in itself can be illuminating for everybody. As I said, the unexpected consequences, when, for instance, peace breaks out all over, or you end up with, the NDP somehow supporting the Conservatives in a minority government, which is, we've seen everything in this last 12 months, so who knows, right? That doesn't seem to make any sense, but you've got in Quebec right now, you've got, NDP voters switching to the Conservatives just, in the last 2 weeks, so who knows? Ideology may not actually be a guiding force anymore. The really important part is the debriefing afterwards, and which, from my experience, has to really be in the time just after the simulation. Like if you do it the same day, when all the passions are still there, I find that's a very useful thing. The student buy-in is absolutely crucial, but one of the nice things about doing these things at the grade 11 or 12 level especially is that students after grade 10 don't have to take history, and so we tend to get some really motivated kids when we do these things. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about, and all the materials, by the way, for any of those simulations except for this one, are on our website at WCI. So I think everybody's been stealing since Socrates. So feel free to rip it off, use it, make it better. That would be great. Share it with me. The 1981 First Ministers' Conference simulation that I've been working on for a bit of time now really comes out of my interest in these events, which I think obviously we live in the shadow of that event still. Trudeau's famous, quotation in the second last day of the conference when he goes out to the media to announce this new alliance, between he and René Lévesque on having a national referendum. And he says famously, "And the cat is among the pigeons." I wanted to include that only because With this particular simulation, the student that you get to play the role of the federal government, and you know, probably 3 of them, really has to have a certain, shall we say, swagger in order to pull this off. The other thing is, besides the fact that we can all teach the basic history of it, is it gives you a really good opportunity to challenge some preconceived notions that the students have and sometimes that the teachers have by looking at some of the documents that have just recently become available for us. Obviously, you've got all of the memoirs, most of which are really, in my view, quite bad. Trudeau's particularly disappointing. Levesque's particularly bitter. But at the same time, you do have, on the anniversary of the patriation, the 30th anniversary a couple years ago, you've got some really interesting stuff coming out. A lot of the op-ed pieces, for instance, that you saw in the Globe and in other places. Brian Peckford, for some strange reason, the former Premier of Newfoundland, is still grasping at, desperately grasping at relevance. And needs to, write an op-ed piece almost every other year on this. The fact that, you can even have the students looking at, for instance, the actual Kitchen Accord negotiated by Chrétien and McMurtry and Romano. And what's interesting there, it's in handwriting, and just like it's a fantastic historical document read to look at. The best part being when they're looking at opting out with compensation. In Chrétien's handwriting, you see "never" written on the side. So it gets them into what the actual positions were. Howard Leeson just recently released the Patriation Minutes. He was the deputy minister from Saskatchewan and kept minutes throughout the whole thing. And these have now been released, which really, if you're interested in doing your own research on this, highly recommend. Because he certainly tries to make the argument that some of the other participants don't get their due. Clearly Romano does, for instance, and others, but people like Bill Davis, for instance, and Lougheed, who comes out very, very well in his interpretation. Speaking of, the long disregarded correspondence between Peter Lougheed and René Lévesque afterwards, I don't know if you're familiar with these, but in terms of preparing students for what will be, I hesitate to call them, sort of post-love letters between, allies. But Lougheed's attempt to explain his behavior at that conference and Lévesque's response and then Lougheed's response is really quite fascinating. So you get an opportunity with that type of simulation really to really get the kids into some primary document research and then a debriefing afterwards, I hope, when I'm really hopeful that they will not come to an agreement, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of alliances they come up with. So that one's still in process, which I look forward to. I think the other thing that this type of experience gives the students is, and I was thinking about this as I was driving here this morning, that in a sense, we live in an interesting political time, with sort of rather clear dog whistle type politics and divisions, and I don't know how the next 2 weeks is going to go, but it's getting ugly, shall we say? And regardless of your positions of who got the better part of this deal and whether there really was a night of the long knives, one of the things that strikes me, in at least my own research into it, is that the level of principled debate back then. Yes, René Lévesque was calling Trudeau Elliotts and so forth and making references to Pure Land Quebecers. But there's a level of principled debate in this that I think students can learn a lot from. Because in the end, what I think on a larger scale, what we are still fighting about in some sense is about the very nature of equality in this country, whether it's equality of provinces, whether it's equality of nations, or whether it's equality of individuals. Somewhat paraphrase Stephen Clarkson, those issues, haunt us still. And so this type of activity, I think, I'm hoping anyway, will have a very fruitful experience with students. So thanks.
Thank you. I hope everyone will join me in thanking our 3 panelists today. And another round for thanking everybody for coming out today.
Thanks,
and enjoying
guys.
this session.
Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.